Sigrid Kaag, former United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of the Netherlands, welcome to Al-Arabiya.
Thank you very much, Talal. Delighted to be here.
I would like to start talking about your departure from the UN system. In addition to the Special Coordinator title, you were also former Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, in addition to other mandates such as being the personal representative of the Secretary General to the Palestine Liberation Organization and to the Palestinian Authority. From the start of your work in Palestine, you wanted a limited term in this job. What was your reasoning for such a request?
Well, I think there are two questions, if I may, just for the sake of the audience. I came back to the system, leaving my government post as Deputy Prime Minister, to serve as the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza. I consider that a moral imperative. We worked for a long time, established the supply routes, we created the openings in the ceasefire. The UN system writ large delivered on the possibility of aid reaching people, and we designed all the plans for the reconstruction of Gaza. I, however, concluded that mandate at the set date, which was end of March this year, and I mainstreamed it into the local existing UN system. In the meantime, there was a leadership vacuum at the political helm, and I undertook that role, but as you said, very consciously, only at my own wishes, as on an ad interim basis. The reasons are as follows. I believe that the UN's role over time in the political spectrum on this conflict has been increasingly marginal at best. The UN is not called upon and not asked. I delivered a lot on my own profile, contacts and experience within the region. However, the function and the role the UN could or should be playing is simply not there. The UN's purpose, or rather deliverable, when it comes to the peace and security agenda has been reduced to what I would call a humanitarian plus effort. And that is not political. The crisis is ultimately drawn from security, the horrors of the 7th of October, the Hamas terror attacks and Islamic Jihad, but the foundations remain political. We're dealing with a humanitarian dystopia imposed on civilians in Gaza, but without a proper political process, without legitimacy of the UN's engagement, particularly the Security Council and its resolutions, we are, to my mind, we are fooling people, and I am not part of that. So I chose to only deliver, to take responsibility, but always against a set time frame, because the call is on member states. They have to carry responsibility and accountability. And there is a collective shame on the international community for having allowed the situation, the suffering of civilians in Gaza, to reach the levels that we see today.
You gave the United Nations 6 months after the former Special Coordinator, the Norwegian diplomat Tor Winsland, left his position. You gave them that time to find someone else. But your advice to them in June, upon your departure, is don't fill the post. Why? Have you given up completely on any political role for the United Nations in the occupied territories?
Well, you see, the role is what I would consider UNSCO, as it's called, the Office of the Special Coordinator for the United Nations in the Middle East peace process, is a legacy. It's a legacy of the Oslo process, when the two parties had an agreement and it was about implementation. As we know, soon after Oslo, Ishaq Rabin was murdered, one of the main architects and the political leaders that owned the process, and there were many other deteriorations and deviations. If we look back now, the Oslo process has been declared all but dead, and the UN's role, never desired by Israel, but certainly now, has no longer been that of a key player on the scene. That doesn't mean one gives up on legitimacy, on the validity of international law, international humanitarian law and resolutions, or the potential the UN has. But to suggest that all capitals are now asking for the UN to please create a peace conference, no, that would be faulty. My advice is, and as I've said this publicly, is to pause, not fill the post. Look at what the UN is asked and able to do right now. One can engage in many different ways, many different levels, and it doesn't have to be from a silo, and it doesn't have to be based in Jerusalem. It's all about effect, impact, credibility, and integrity. And, you know, many a time, if you ask a Palestinian, or if a Palestinian would ask me, so what do you do now, Sigrid? And I say, well, I'm this and that. And they would say, there is no process, there's no peace. When I meet the Israelis, they would say, oh, is there a peace process at all? Why have I not heard about it? So it's quite telling, let me put it that way. The United Nations ultimately is the will and the embodiment of the will, not only of the Charter and international law, but ultimately the political will by member states. And if you look at the era you and I live in now, it is very different from, let's say, the heydays of the post-Second World War international order. We're dealing with transactional diplomacy at best. We're dealing with the coercive use of instruments, an erosion of the international world order the way it was established, with opportunities, but also profound crisis and a marginalization of what the system could bring. And we have to be honest about that, particularly for the people that are most vulnerable and still look towards those institutions to deliver on the promise that they hold on behalf of what is called we the people, as it's phrased in the Charter.
I'd like to move now to the humanitarian situation in Gaza. We are dealing with starvation, extreme poverty. Who is to blame? Who is responsible when there is no lack of supplies, no lack of medicine, and you have a functioning system to deliver it at the UN?
Yeah, well, you know, I'm now, as you know, I've left, but we've always been very clear, if I say collective, from the Secretary General, my colleague Tom Fletcher, my former colleague, as I am former, myself, and everybody else who works day in, day out in Gaza. International humanitarian law is very clear on the warring parties. Israel's the occupation authority, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and others, the other militant groups. Very clear as to what should happen. Aid is not a negotiating tool. It is being used to wage a war, or rather to seemingly help achieve war objectives that are elusive and fluid as ever. And ultimately, the population is being denied the ultimate means of bare survival. The blame game is happening every day, as we see in the reciprocal propaganda. I'm not lending myself to that. We have the courts for that. The ICJ has been clear, and all the other instruments. Parties have to be held to account. But before that, we need to save lives. And it's very clear the United Nations has always, everywhere in the world, delivered. Yes, there are flaws. Yes, there should be improvements. If there is a risk or proof of aid diversion, that in this case aid falls in the hands of Hamas, we need to tackle that. But by blocking the system, disabling the system from reaching people, that is not the way. And that onus is on the occupation authority. And the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, as we know, presents a weaponized approach. And we've only seen innocent civilians having to choose between death or chancing the moment they may get a hold of some food. They may.
More than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed and nearly 5,000 wounded at distribution points managed by the militarized Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, where Israeli forces open fire on starving civilians, including women and children, while waiting for some aid. Do you think the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation can be altered, can be overhauled to make it a safe and reliable humanitarian operation?
Well, you have to seriously change, I think, its design. But yes, it could always be amended, but one has to be willing. I don't read that. The UN team, I was part and parcel also of some of these discussions at high political level on the design of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, not the details. They were presented to us. We critiqued them immediately. Our technical teams offered advice, guidance, registered early on all the serious concerns we had, and it just went along. You've seen the reconstruction in the Financial Times and other international newspapers. The design of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, to my mind, and I've always said this to Israeli counterparts, has been seriously flawed. It's been designed from a military objective and to deny any risk of aid falling in the hands of Hamas. It didn't take into account that you need to reach civilians safely and securely. You cannot militarize aid, you cannot weaponize aid, and the basic principles of humanitarian aid distribution, as have been expressed many a time by the UN. It's very clear, and the UN is there in numbers, and we can do it at scale. But the UN system and the international NGOs, as well as the very brave Palestinian-led NGOs in Gaza, are not in a position, because they are being disabled, as I said, to actually perform in the way they could. And the only ones who pay the price are innocent civilians, mothers, children. I think none of us would ever have expected images of starvation, acute malnutrition we see in Gaza over the recent months. And you only need to drive out of Gaza 5 kilometers, you can go to the best petrol stations, you can get your luxury coffee, you can get all the food you want. This is not a distant place hard to reach. It is just around the corner.
Last Monday, OCHA said that 87.7% of Gaza population is now under displacement orders or within Israeli militarized zones, squeezing 2.1 million people into a fragmented area of the Strip, where hardly there are any services are available. What do you think Israel's ultimate objective of all this?
Well, I think I've never been in the game of speculation, but we have to judge by what some Israeli politicians in positions of leadership in the cabinet are stating. You have the extreme voices, the extremist voices of Minister Smotrich and Minister Ben-Gvir, who have, I think, said things akin, maybe not literally, to flattening Gaza, doing away with the entire population. These are senior cabinet ministers. Then Minister Katz talked about the preparation of a humanitarian city. In earlier statements, he and Prime Minister Netanyahu have said they want to help realize the dream of the Gaza Riviera of President Trump. I think we're all profoundly concerned, countries of the region, Palestinians themselves, and as should be the international community. There can be no forced displacement. And we have to be very clear as well, international law is quite specific. When a population's lives have been rendered impossible because the area through war and conscious measures taken has been rendered uninhabitable, there's no longer any talk of voluntary migration, even if somebody were to say, please get me out of here, because the situation has been rendered untenable. That is tantamount to forced displacement. Now, you've seen the statement the other day by a large number of European countries, the United Kingdom and others, where they spoke also of their opposition to forced displacement. But ultimately, words are nice. But member states have to address the reality on the ground that is not only grim, but doesn't create a proper framework for, let's say, peaceful resolution. Because ultimately, the goal needs to remain the two-state solution, a safe and secure Israel and a viable independent Palestinian state. And in all this, Talal, let's not forget, Israeli hostages and maybe some other nationalities are also still being held, and their families want them to be returned home safely, and the remains of those who lost their lives to be returned. We have to look at it through the lens of our shared humanity.
Arab states endorsed a 91-page proposal for the future of Gaza, with about $53 billion budget for reconstruction over a 5-year period. It's called the Cairo Plan, and stated that for the first 6 months, the territory would be run by a non-partisan technocratic committee overseen by the Palestinian Authority. Do you think this plan is still viable, and will the estimate remain the same?
Well, I think the plan is viable as much as member states want it to happen. So yes, is it difficult at a technical level? Is it hard to recover and reconstruct a terrain that has been purposefully, decimated to next to nothing? There's not a building standing in sight. If Deir Balah will be destroyed as well, I think that's the end of most civilian infrastructure. But yes, it's still doable. The financing can be found as well once there is clarity on the two key questions. The security arrangements, from the one side, of course, easing and facilitating what are Israeli requirements for security, but also security within Gaza. What is proper security? What is law and order? Who will deliver on that? With a link to statehood building and governance, of course. The return of the PA has always been the ask of the international community. Now the Cairo plan, which has been co-created with the Palestinian Authority / PLO, speaks of a transitional arrangement. Indeed, an independent Palestinian leader, local leaders. There are many other variations, but you need to have a horizon. These cannot be tactical decisions that will basically render Gaza back to the open-air prison it was before the horror attacks, the terror attacks of 7th of October. It cannot be that. Statehood, you see, is not a reward. Statehood is a right. And I think the international community owes that to both parties, to the Israelis, and it owes it very much to the Palestinians. There's no change. There cannot be a significant investment in stability and stabilization. Now, the price tag undoubtedly will have gone up further, given the scale of destruction, but also the further trauma incurred, the fact that special treatment is needed for so many of the civilians. War is never cheap. It is a horror. And this particular conflict is, I think, horrendous. And it's a stain on our shared humanity. It simply is.
On the political level, what are your expectations for the high-level two-state solution international conference here next Monday and Tuesday in the United Nations headquarters in New York?
Well, I haven't been privy to the latest, but and it's easier to judge from the outside. But let's put it this way. I don't think Israel has been very sensitive in the last decades to this form of pressure. The only lever of influence and power can be exercised by the United States. International consensus is extremely important, but frankly speaking, you go back to the current crisis in Gaza. What are member states willing to do, and how would they deliver on a ceasefire? If that doesn't happen, all conferences on the two-state solution are important in terms of direction of travel, but Palestine is fading away as we speak due to settlement expansion, settlement infrastructure, housing demolitions, and basically a new generation of Israelis. At the moment, there's not a single Israeli, or very few, and they're very courageous, that speaks about the future after Gaza. The empathy factor and button has sort of disappeared. The trauma on both sides for different reasons is blocking, and it needs international leadership, and particularly by the US, to help, I would say, unfreeze that. If that is coming, I don't know. Good that the international community shows its support, solidarity, and its political direction. But if history is any indicator for the success of these types of formulas, I am more doubtful. It needs to happen from within the region and by the region, with American pressure.
Time has caught up with us. I have one last question for you. How do you see the future of multilateralism in the coming years?
It's quite bleak. The need for reform, in particular of the United Nations, is very clear to all. How ambitious and which reforms is always a matter of negotiation, but we cannot keep going, keep saying and working and talking in the same way as we've done in the past. The world has changed since World War II. many other avenues. A number of member states are going from transactional diplomacy to plurilateral arrangements, and the old global platform has its sway. You'd want to reinvent it if it didn't exist, but it needs to be fit for purpose of the 21st century. And that's not in the current structure and current format. And that requires two, bold leadership, but above all, the engagement and financing of the stakeholders, the shareholders. And those are still the same member states. They need to see the value, but also need to be members of a club that is not à la carte. You remember, it's the full scope of responsibility. Sovereignty holds responsibility.
Sigrid Kaag, former United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, we thank you for this exclusive television interview and, of course, for your service along the years. And we were witness to it and wish you the very, very best for the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Stella.